Greetings and welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm glad you could be here. Before we begin, please remember this. If you enjoyed this content, please consider hitting that like button, dropping a comment, sharing this video with a friend, and subscribing if you haven't already. Now, on with the story. The Deathworlders by Philip R. Johnson, aka Hambone, Hambone HFY, and Hambone 3110. Chapter 18, Baggage, Part 3. Date point, 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, 5 days, AV. HMS Caledonia, approaching the Gaoian system. Captain Rajesh Patini. Signal from the lead patrol vessel, Captain. Translates to, unidentified vessel, you are approaching the sovereign territory of the clans of Gao. You will halt before crossing the border or be met with deadly force. Comply immediately. Patini nodded, the picture of calm as he settled his cup of tea back in its saucer. All stop. Aye, aye, all stop. All stop, the helmsman repeated, obeying instantly. There was no visible change in the outside view. They had already dropped from the huge apparent velocities of interstellar travel to a much slower, much noisier approach that the Gaoian military couldn't possibly have failed to notice. The stars had not visibly been moving for nearly 10 minutes now. As they dropped to a sublight velocity, the most that anybody inside Caledonia's bridge could detect was a faint lurch. From the outside, as the Gaoian vessels came to a halt around them, the deceleration was so much more visibly violent. It wasn't so much that the ships arrived as that they appeared. Their incomprehensible speed, a term that wasn't really applicable to the way that warp drives worked, but sufficed in the absence of an alternative, only hinted by an eye blink's worth of motion blur before the ships were just there, solid and drifting as if they had never been anywhere else. He admired their tactics. While it clearly betrayed that they were ignorant of Caledonia's blink-jump tactics, the configuration was excellent, placing all three ships in a position so that, no matter which vector Caledonia might accelerate along, a minimum of 2 of the Gaoian craft would have a firing solution on her, and one that made sure that no allied craft was in danger of being hit by stray fire. An unlikely event when you're talking about distances of hundreds of kilometers, but still a sensible precaution. Odyssey and Edda had both stopped at a rendezvous point 2 parsecs out and were on a hair trigger to jump in via wormhole if summoned. While Caledonia's own systems were only on about 60% charge, needing only 5% to effect an immediate retreat to Cimbrean, theirs would be fully charged by now, primed and ready to fight as hard as humanly possible in the event that it became necessary. Patini was resolved that under no circumstances would it become necessary. The very last thing they needed now was to disgruntle a potential ally. Best behavior, people. I don't want a peep of activity out of anything that might even smell like a weapon on their sensors, he said. Signal from the lead ship, Captain. It reads as, identify yourselves. I've wanted to say this for a long time, he confided, standing up. On screen. Date point, 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, 5 days, AV. The Scar, Cimbrean, the Far Reaches. Dr. Mary Cleveland. Dr. Mary Cleveland had come to Cimbrean for the simple reason that it opened up a hitherto unexplored field of science, xenomycology, the study of alien fungi, or at least alien life forms that were functionally very similar to fungi. Persuading her husband Colin to join her and become the human race's first xenobacteriologist in the field had been as simple as suggesting it. Both of them were, of course, trained in the proper use of protective clothing to isolate themselves from their samples. But she had only imagined ever needing it in the lab to prevent contamination of the samples. Protecting herself from a potential threat had never really been considered before. This was supposed to be a Class 4 planet. That had been before they saw the mark up close. What had looked like a thin brown line in the satellite photo had turned out to be a comprehension-defyingly large swath of forest. From the shuttle, it stretched horizon to horizon in one direction and filled half the world below in the other, flanked with sickly yellows, whites, and blacks. The brown was death. Trees had fallen and nothing was growing to replace them. Streams were choked with scum and froth. They circled over one abscessuous hole in the forest where even the fallen trees were gone, and inside it, Mary could see the skeleton of some native beast the size of a horse, and it already looked incomplete. "The shuttle sensors are next to useless," the pilot reported, "but it's good for atmospheric composition. Have a look at this." The scientists crowded around, leaving poor Mary stuck in the back, too short to see the display. Hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, putrescine? "Bloody hell, now I'm glad we're wearing the suits," somebody commented. "It must smell like shit out there." "Lovely," the pilot muttered. "Guess I'm in for a treat when that ramp comes down." "Is there any way to set down upwind of the area?" "Close enough. You mind walking a half-mile or so?" The consensus was that they didn't, so the shuttle spun down to drop its passengers off on a rock that lunged up from amongst the trees, forming the point of a gentle slope down into the forest. Aside from a slightly intimidating dash down the ramp onto solid ground, it was an easy walk. Down among the foliage, the damage was alarming. They were a good kilometer ahead of the apparent border of the damage that was visible from the air, but it was immediately obvious that the true leading edge of this landscape-eating sickness was far ahead of the yellowing and death. Every surface of every living thing was squalid with wet orange and off-white spots. The light filtering through the canopy borrowed a wretched hue from the infection, leaving the whole science team feeling filthy even inside their suits. "Bacterial growths, Colin." Colin nodded, rubbing a leaf between two gloved fingers. It disintegrated. "It could well be. Grab a sample. I'll try and culture them back at Folktha." "Those, on the other hand," Mary said, as the man with the sample bag produced a sterile tube and swab and set about collecting samples, "are definitely fungal." She was referring to a mat of white fibers that had completely overrun one limb of a nearby tree. "Don't go near that," Dr. Stevenson warned her as she started to approach. When she turned and looked at him for an explanation, he dug a rock out of the soil and threw it at the branch. It cracked, and a quarter-ton of wood sagged on the trunk before crashing down. Everyone on the team carefully stepped away from any overhanging limbs. Samples gathered, they pressed onwards, and with each tree things seemed to get worse, but none of them were quite prepared for the abrupt change. There was practically a line on the ground where the living but infected plants gave way to dead, decomposing wreckage. In fact, there was a line. A meandering one as wide as a human forearm was long, and the color of pus. Samples were gathered from that and from either side of it, and the air was captured for later analysis. A stream, presumably once bubbling and pretty, but now more closely resembling the contents of a sewer, was likewise sampled, as was the putrefying carcass of another horse-sized animal. Past that point, the damage almost seemed to play in a perverse kind of reverse. It wasn't that there was anything alive and healthy beyond the wave edge of the disease, but the ground stopped slipping and squelching underfoot. The air became less heavy with spores and foulness. Eventually, they reached the denuded heart of the scar and found only bare soil, already starting to form a channel where the nightly rains were washing it away. They sampled everything. Finally, as the sun was starting to set, they regrouped, and the important question was asked. "Well?" Mary looked around at the rot, at the destruction, at the death, and at the river which was carrying the foulness who knew how far away. "Well, so much for Cimbrean," she said. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, 5 days, AV. Cimbrean, the far reaches. Ava Rios. "Ava!" The cold light of flashlight between the trees. The sound of a voice she loved on the edge of fear. It should have bothered her. "Ava!" An older voice. A clear one. She loved him too. She loved everyone, but especially Adam and Gabriel. "Over here!" "Oh, hey, Sarah!" "Ava, what's up?" The expression of worry on her face was kind of funny. Her own low and happy laughter sounded creepy even to Ava herself, and that just made her laugh more. "Oh, I'm great. I'm fine," she promised. This didn't seem to reassure Sarah, which made her laugh again. crackling and snapping in the bushes, more cold, unnatural light. Adam, baby, you want to get married? What? Ava, are you drunk? Didn't drink nothing, no sir, she giggled. More like high. Gabriel, Daddy! She sang the words as it turned into another giggle. I'm so lucky. 2 daddies in one lifetime. I'm a lucky girl. She didn't understand the strange glances they exchanged. That was funny, but she was already giggling, so there wasn't room for more. Come on, Ava, let's get you back to Folkla. Ah, come on. Let's go swimming again. I didn't get to go earlier. Look, I brought my swimsuit. For Christ's sake, girl, put that back on. Take it off. Put it on. Make up your mind. Dad, I'll handle her. You'd better figure out what did this. Oh, no handle. Adam. She didn't really fight him. She was too tired. Date point. 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, 5 days AV. HMS Caledonia, near the Gaoian system. Captain Rajesh Patini. Gaoian really did sound very much like Chinese. Not in the specific sounds, but in the general cadence and flow of the language, the way it sounded to a native English speaker's ear. Having Gaoian on the bridge to take over negotiations had proven to be the right choice. For all their supposed positive attitude towards humanity, it had been known for years that Gaoian politics were completely fractured, and unless you were speaking to a female, you had no direct line to anything resembling a unified government. Evidently, there were factions within the military who regarded the Deathworlders as a serious threat, even in the face of the most overt peaceful gestures that Bethini could muster. Not so different from home, then, really. If the Gaoian language reminded him of the Chinese, then so too did their commander's attitude. Fleetmaster, he interjected, using the title that the translator and Gaoian both had given. It was my understanding that our species have, so far in these past short years, enjoyed a good relationship. I don't see why I would want to break that trust now, nor why, or even how, we would do this. It is thanks to your species that hunter attacks on our outposts and shipping have increased, the snow-muzzled, aging fleetmaster snapped at him. I am tasked with safeguarding my people from all threats, and collaboration with your species seems to me to be a certain invitation to further retribution from those monsters. We are going to have to do something about that bad image, Patini thought to himself as he picked his next words carefully. The hunters have failed against the humans almost every time, Gaoian said before Patini could finish assembling his sentence. If your motive is fear, old father, then these here are the species to be more afraid of. He showed his teeth, which was apparently not a friendly gesture in Gaoian body language. Not to mention the ones less likely to eat you, he added. Trying to intimidate me on their behalf, pup, the fleetmaster snarled, but he didn't fool Bethini. Gaoian had scored a hit. Even the old Gaoian wasn't quite wily enough to hide it. Am I? I don't find facts very intimidating, White Snout, Gaoian retorted, calmly matching the insult with one of his own. How dare! The fleetmaster began to object. Gaoian actually leapt forward and made a furious yipping noise toward his senior's projection. Senile! Blind! He snapped. So afraid of today that he'll quiver under a rock to save his hide and let his cubs die tomorrow. Bethini leaned forward to whisper in his Gaoian's pointed ear. Gaoian, are you sure this is... he began, but he could see glances in the background behind the fleetmaster. As abruptly as it had begun, the conversation ended as the furious father cut the link. The tension of the ensuing pause lasted 2 whole cups of tea before finally a hail from the lead Gaoian ship came through. This time, the figure on screen was a different Gaoian, obviously junior to the fleetmaster, but not by much. Of the fleetmaster himself, there was no sign. Caledonia, you have permission to enter the Gaoian system under our escort, he declared. Do not deviate from your assigned path or power your weapons or shields. Bethini raised an eyebrow at Gaoian, who, alien body language be damned, was obviously feeling very pleased with himself. We understand and obey, he replied calmly. Thank you. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, 6 days AV. Folk the colony Cimbrean. The far reaches. Gabriel Ares.
Okay, thanks for coming. We're sorry for the short notice of this thing, but this is important.
Gabriel Ares stood up and held up the unadorned aluminum rod that marked him as the speaker for now. Both it and the silver shield badge of the colonial police on his jacket shone in the blue morning sunlight.
First, as you've all probably heard, I can confirm that one of the children was evacuated back to Earth last night with a case of poisoning, he began. We've just received word from Scotch Creek that she's made a full recovery, and while they plan on keeping her under observation for safety's sake over the next couple of days, she should be returning with the next group of colonists.
There was a general relieved sigh and some muttering. Ava was popular, especially amongst the elders at the Faith Center. Concern had been flickering around Folktha like lightning in a mountain storm all morning. Gabriel held up the speaker stick a little higher to quiet them down.
We've identified the plant that poisoned her. Cimbreaner Caledonia dalani, the Cimbrean tea plant. The young shoots seem to have a potent drug effect when chewed raw. We need to know if anybody else has been using these plants recreationally.
Chatter erupted, and Gabriel banged his walking stick down a few times to restore silence.
I want to make it perfectly clear that nobody is in trouble.
He raised his voice.
The matter of whether or not we should be treating that tea as an illegal narcotic is a subject for a future thing. But for now, we need to know if anyone's been using it to get high so that we can make sure they've not harmed their liver function or anything.
After a little more chatter, a handful of people stepped forward. The Tisdales, he was unsurprised to note, were amongst them.
Right. Sorry, folks, but you're all going back to Earth for a day or two. We don't have the facilities here to properly test or treat you. Haley, Mark, your kids can go with you or they can sleep around my place.
The thing cleared up rapidly after that. The Tisdales agreed to let Sarah and Jack stay with Gabriel. There were a few questions which Gabriel definitely put off until next time before finally retiring to let the colony finish discussing it on their own while he retired to his office. In privacy, he ran his hands through his hair and swore softly. It was still hard to believe that Ava, of all people, had been so stupid. He was beginning to doubt his own parenting decisions. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, 6 days AV. The Grand Conclave. Hunter Space. Alpha of the Brood That Builds. The Alpha of the Brood That Builds could feel its maw watering. To be a hunter was to hunt. The need for it was programmed into their genetic essence, playing even a critical role in their reproduction. A hunter was only fertile within the few days after a successful hunt, at which point, if so ordered by its alpha, it might go into a reproductive trance and willingly enter the spawning pools. There, its own young would devour it from within. Small and agile little swimmers with little to their name but sharp teeth would burst in a bloody froth from the disintegrating corpse of their parent, leaving only clean bones and cybernetics to sink to the bottom of the pool. Over the coming months, live prey slaves would periodically be thrown in, to be ripped apart in a feeding frenzy by the increasingly mature hunter young, until they were finally developed enough to haul themselves out of the pool and be escorted away to receive their first implants and join the ranks, to have knowledge and skills force-fed into their brains via cybernetic data shunts, joining the brood of their parent. The exception was the brood that builds. Where a normal hunter's eyes were solid black or red, those of the brood that builds were identifiable from the moment they clambered from the spawning waters by their green eyes and the distinctive zigzag pupils. They held themselves slightly different. Their craniums were that little bit larger, their natural claws absent, their endoskeletal structure that little bit better suited for heavy lifting and carrying than for combat. They were the largest brood by dint of being swelled by the breeding of other broods, as well as by their own offspring. But to the brood that builds, a successful hunt was something very different. To them, an engineer's obsession with problem-solving was as natural as breath and feeding. In their instincts, prey was an outstanding unresolved technical challenge, and the hunt was a solution to that challenge. To the brood that builds, installing an ingenious sewage system was on par with raiding a prey freighter. Deploying an orbiting array of energy collectors to within millimeter tolerances was rewarded by an ecstasy that other hunters could only find in the flesh of humans. And now this, the prey of a lifetime, actual sensor records of a human starship in action, fighting in ways that defied immediate comprehension. A quarry without compare. The Alpha knew that if it succeeded in this task, it would have to spawn afterwards. The urge would be far too powerful. The pheromones and hormones of its deadly birthing would produce strong hunters, the finest minds ever seen by the brood that builds. It relished and anticipated the thought. The Alpha of Alphas was in an indulgent mood, but there were limits.
Impatience, demand.
Can you learn their secrets?
It demanded.
Confidence, gratitude.
The Alpha of Alphas has given me a fine prey to chase, but whatever solution the primitive Deathworld beasts can invent, I can invent also. These secrets will be yours,
The Alpha Builder replied.
Query.
And how long would it take to introduce this technology to our brood vessels?
Thoughtful estimation.
That would depend on the nature of the technology and how much of the swarm would thus be outfitted.
Clarification.
The entire swarm of swarms. Every last ship. This technology allows the Deathworlders to slip their cage and turn it into a wall against us. We will now devote all of our efforts into penetrating their fortress and butchering every last one. Surprise, timid objection. Greatest one, even if the secret turns out to be trivial, that will take years. Anger, your place is not to object. Your place is to obey.
The Alpha Builder cowered as the Alpha of Alphas rose from its Volziscal throne and spread its cybernetic claws.
Plication, obedience. It shall be as the Alpha of Alphas commands,
It mentally squeaked.
Satisfaction. Good. Get to work.
The Alpha of Alphas paused as the Alpha Builder scurried away.
Threat. Understand something, Alpha of the brood that builds.
It fixed the lesser Alpha with a stern glare from all 7 of its eyes.
If you reproduce before every last human has been devoured, then I shall personally filter your spawn from their pool and have them fed to the spawn of another.
The Alpha Builder swallowed, a subconscious gesture that, unbeknownst to either species, exactly mirrored its meaning in humans.
Fearful understanding.
It sent and scurried away. Suddenly, this new prey seemed so much less exciting to it. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 3 weeks AV. Austin, Texas. United States of America, Earth. Kevin Jenkins. Hey, is, Moira home? The man in the door looked him up and down. If your name's Kevin Jenkins, he decided, she ain't. Kevin sighed and nodded gently. It is, yeah. Anger flashed in the other man's eyes. In that case, pal, your restraining order. I've got this, baby. Moira kissed the man in the door on the cheek, and after a quick check to make sure she was certain, he retreated inside. Moira leaned on the doorframe. He's right. That restraining order ain't going away, she said. I know. Why are you here, Kevin? I thought you were going to leave us in peace. I was hoping maybe I could try and unfuck up one thing, Kevin said. What, you're here to apologize? Kevin shook his head. You and I both know there's not enough sorry in this world, Moira. Not after what I... the sentence trailed off. Even now, in the act of cleansing himself, he couldn't bear to repeat what his own irresponsibility had done to Callie.
You're fucking right, she snarled, advancing out of the house. She's inside. God willing, if she even looks out here, she won't remember who you are. How dare you come here?
I'm not staying, he reassured. Just, I know I can't see her, Moira, but I have to apologize to her.
You're not seeing her.
I know, Kevin replied. Look, I've got this letter. You can read it. You decide whether to give it to her. You can burn it if you want, but I just can't leave without at least trying.
Leave? She asked suspiciously, snatching the letter from his hand. You came back just to leave again?
Earth. I'm leaving Earth. I got a job with the Byron Group in one of their exploration ships, and I'm leaving. Forever. Date point. 4 years, 8 months, 3 weeks AV. Folk the Colony, Cimbrean. The Far Reaches. Dr. Mary Cleveland. Peptostreptococcus magnus, that's definitely E. coli, no two ways about it, and yep, I'd bet my life on it. That's Enterococcus faecanum. Well, that clenches it. Governor Sandy was no scientist, but he was a highly educated, highly literate man.
Faecanum, as in feces, he said.
Oh yes, these are all Terran species of bacteria, every one of them native to the human gastrointestinal tract, Dr. Cleveland said, still examining the images being produced by the electron microscope.
As are the fungi we recovered, his wife added.
Colin nodded. Aside from the scale, it's a pretty classic cross-section of the kind of flora you'd find in an ordinary healthy bowel movement.
Sandy grimaced and pinched his nose. Delaney, he said.
Must be. The scar describes pretty much perfectly the direct route from the site of her escape pod to here. If we assume one comfort break a day or so...
Even one would have done it, Mary said. You can't blame her, Governor. I don't, he assured her. Is there anything we can do? Mary sighed. I suspect something like this would have eventually happened anyways, she said. In the absence of any bacteriivores or immune system capable of keeping them in check, the bacteria and fungi are feasting and reproducing as fast as they possibly can. Deathworld microbes loose in an ecosystem that simply can't cope. This was never not going to happen from the moment a human first landed here.
Sir Jeremy listened to her patiently.
I thought the disease suppression implants, he said.
Those rid us of a whole raft of communicable diseases based on the case of one human who managed to infect a whole ship full of viscatics. They're actually targeted at a fairly short list of bugs, Colin shook his head. They ignore our gut microbiome by design. If they completely sterilize the human digestive tract, they'd probably kill us. Sir Jeremy made an exasperated noise.
Bloody, sloppy, half-baked alien solutions, he cursed. Very well. Is there any way we can stop this thing?
Wendy shook her head and gave him the hard truth.
Almost certainly not, now that it's so advanced, she said apologetically. I'm sorry, Sir Jeremy, but all of our noble goals towards conserving the ecology of this planet were doomed before we even got here.
Shit. Coming from a man who was not known to swear, this prompted a round of sympathetic nodding. Sir Jeremy had been passionate from the word go about preserving Cimbrean's native life, and certainly nobody in the colony disagreed with him on that endeavor. He wiped away a futile tear.
Fine. Is there anything we can do?
Colin and Mary exchanged glances. The death of a whole planetary biosphere isn't exactly our field, Colin demurred.
Is it anyone's?
I suppose not, Colin frowned, thinking.
The knock-on consequences are total, Mary said. No plants means no oxygen, so we're on borrowed time now before Cimbrean ceases to be an inhabitable planet.
Good husband that he was, Colin was on the same wavelength instantly. And if there's nothing we can do to stop them from dying, then the only option is to replace them.
And the only readily available plants which could survive in soil contaminated with Terran microorganisms would be, well, Terran ones, Wendy finished. You're proposing that, what, an ecosystem transplant? That sounds like an impossibly large task.
Vast, Colin agreed. But it's either that or abandon this planet and watch it die.
We'd need to bring in everything, Mary said. Trees, grass, bushes, bees, birds, insects, rodents, birds, fungi, algae, fish, everything all the way up to apex predators. Impossible, surely, Sir Jeremy protested. Replacing the ecosystem of an entire planet, that's far too large a task.
But we don't need to replace it across the whole planet at first, Colin pointed out. If the aliens are right about Deathworld species, and the evidence of this bacterial event suggests that they are, Mary nodded,
then we only need to introduce the immigrant species along the length of the scar. That might even help contain the infection and slow it, if we introduce things in the right order.
Colin nodded. Of course, the Terran species would ultimately outcompete and supplant the natives, but if we're very lucky, a few mutant strains might make it through the mass extinction event and we'll have a few Cimbrean natives for posterity.
Is that feasible?
The Clevelands looked at each other, back to him, and simultaneously they shrugged.
We're not even remotely qualified to plan more than a tiny part of that process, Mary said. It's precisely the opposite of what I came to Cimbrean to achieve, Sir Jeremy objected, though it was at best a defeated token objection rather than a serious dissent. She's already terminally ill, Colin replied. She either becomes barren and uninhabitable, or we terraform her. Those are the only options I can see. He glanced at Mary, who'd nodded her agreement. Sir Jeremy sat down, took off his glasses and cleaned them on his tie. Is this likely to happen everywhere we go? He asked.
Well, Colin cleared his throat. His expression confirmed that the answer was an affirmative, and that he really didn't want to say it. Wendy finished for him.
They do call us Deathworlders,
she said, and pointed at Firebird's image of the scar as the governor put his glasses back on.
Well, there's the proof.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I am the Casual Deathworlder, your host, and this has been the conclusion of The Deathworlders, Chapter 18. I hope you enjoyed this content as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting that like button, dropping us a comment down below, and maybe sharing this video with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, please consider hitting that subscribe button down there. As always, a shout out to my editor, Graygor. Thank you very much, buddy. I could not do this without you. Okay, gonna cut this one a little short. Got more recording to do. Going on vacation here in a couple of weeks and want to get far enough ahead that I don't leave you all in the lurch while I'm gone. I also want to try and get far enough ahead so that when I do finally start up my Patreon, I might be able to offer potentially early access as one of the perks. We shall see. So, in the meantime, I will see you all in Chapter 19. Actually, I'll see you all in Chapter 19 or earlier in Princess of Mars. Okay. In the meantime, be safe, be well. I love you all. Bye-bye.